and recommended dietary intake. So these two are different, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Estimate average requirement is used for group and populations, and recommended dietary intake is used for individual assessment. For your assessment task 1, make sure when you compare different nutrients, if you're meeting the requirements, that you look at recommended dietary intake. So NIV Working Party reviewed hundreds of research studies to determine the requirement for each nutrient, so how much we need to get from the diet. So that Working Party selected different criterion for each nutrient based on various roles in performing activities within our body and also in reducing disease risk. An examination of all available data revealed that each person's body is unique, which is not a surprise, and has its own set of requirements. Men differ from women, and needs change as people grow from infancy to old age. Remember, we talked about life cycle nutrition. For this reason, recommendations for people are clustered into groups based off age and gender. So again, when you look at and compare different nutrients, it's very important to take a look at age and gender. So the requirements for people at the same, even requirements for the same age, the same gender, also might be a bit different. So for example, if you look at the figures there, a person A might need 40 milligrams of something, on some particular nutrient on each day. Person B might need only 35, and person C might actually need 57. So looking at enough people, based on that research, might reveal that the individual requirements fall into this symmetrical distribution, with most or near the midpoint, and only a few have into extremes. So or they need very low, or they need quite high amounts of that particular nutrient. So using this information, the Working Party could determine the estimate average requirement. So on average, if we consume this amount, people meet the requirements. But once a nutrient requirement is established, the Working Party had to decide so what intake to recommend for everybody, so everyone will be able to meet those requirements. So this is refers to recommended dietary intake. So as you can see in the distribution on the figure on the right, if we set the value, let's say 45 units, then the person C actually will develop deficiency because if we recommend this is how much you need to eat, so the person is out of the that range. So then it will be obviously may lead to some health problems. So when people's nutrient intakes are consistently deficient, the nutrient stores decline, and over time this decline can lead to poor health and deficiency symptoms. Therefore, to ensure that the nutrients recommended dietary intake meet the needs as many people as possible, and that's why we said that 97–98% of people will if they consume that amount of nutrient, will meet the needs. It may not always be possible to determine the estimated average requirement, as evidence may be insufficient or it might be too conflicting. So in these cases, we use adequate intake, which sets the value and becomes as recommended dietary intake. So for each nutrient, upper level of intake also needs to be set. So this is the highest level of nutrient that is likely to pose no adverse risk to health in most individuals and in specified life stage and group. So individual intakes above UL may place individual or populations group at risk of adverse effects. So remember, it talks about toxicities. So the recommended intakes for nutrients are generous, and they do not necessarily cover every individual for every nutrient. However, it is probably best not to exceed those recommendations by very much or very often. Individual tolerances for high doses of nutrients may vary, and somewhere above the recommended intake is the point beyond which a nutrient is likely to become toxic. So this point is known as upper level intake. It is naive and I guess inaccurate to think that recommendations as a minimum amount. A more accurate view is to see persons' nutrient needs as falling within a range, so with the marginal and danger zones both below and above, as in the figure there. So paying attention to upper levels is particularly useful in guarding against the overconsumption of nutrients, which may occur when people use large dose, for example, supplements or fortified foods regularly. And so that's why when we talk about intake of vitamins and minerals, so if you get enough from your diet, you don't really need to consume extra vitamins for that. So just to remind you about energy requirements. Estimated energy requirements are used to help people to maintain energy balance, good health, but also a healthy weight. So the other measure when we think about macronutrients and energy requirements, because they provide energy for us, the acceptable macronutrient distribution range is used and is set. Again, it will vary depending on the individual. And just to remind you, in order to reduce, I guess, risk of chronic diseases and support their health, most people need to consume about 45% to 65% should come from carbohydrates, from 20 to 35 from fats, and 15 to 25 from protein. So protein requirements also varies depending on the gender and also age. So as example here, in terms of calculating protein requirements, so if we have a person, 30-year-old male, weighing about 75 kilograms, so how many protein that person needs? So first calculation will be, first you need to refer to RDI, so recommended dietary intake, because it's individual, remember, not population. Then you need to look at the gender and then also age group, and this is how you can calculate. I provided a calculation below and also calculator that you can check in terms of protein intake. And this is how the table will look like, looking at estimated average requirements and RDI. So for individual, we use RDI, and for men and women will be different, and also for different age group, you will look at different value. So those set recommendations may seem simple, but they are subjected to some misunderstanding and controversy. So, for example, estimated and adequate energy requirements, it's important to remember that it's applied to healthy people. They need to be adjusted for malnourished people or those with medical problems who may require some supplements or restricted intakes. So recommendations, they are not, I guess, minimum requirements, or they are not optimal intakes for all individuals. Recommendations can only target most people, but cannot account for some variations for each individual. However, some research in genetics, so there are some breakthroughs that which may allow some nutrition scientists to actually determine optimal nutrient intakes. Until then, only dietitians and qualified health professionals can help determine recommendations, very specific recommendations for each individual. So most nutrient goals that you need to meet on a daily basis can actually come through diets composed of variety of foods whenever possible. Because foods contain a mixture of nutrients and non-nutrients, and they deliver more than just nutrients covered by those recommendations. However, excess intakes of minerals and vitamins are unlikely be toxic when it comes from food. However, if you take or people take some extra supplements, this may increase the risk of toxicities. So recommendations apply to average daily intakes. Trying to meet those recommendations on daily basis, so you don't need to calculate and make sure that you meet all those nutrients on a daily basis, which will be, first of all, be very difficult, and it's not necessary. It's unnecessary, basically. So the length of time in which people intakes can actually pose some risk of deficiency. So depending on the nutrients, so some nutrients, so for example, some B vitamin or vitamin C, deprivation may lead to rapid development of deficiency and some symptoms, so you will find this very soon, within days or weeks. But other vitamins, for example, vitamin A deficiencies, they develop quite slow, so you will see those deficiencies within months or years. So their conclusion, I guess the key point is that you don't need to calculate your nutrient intake every single day, as long as you eat balanced and variety of diets, variety of foods. So here I listed those key messages that I said in the previous slide. So when you will get your results from your food work analysis, this is how you can interpret your findings. Just be mindful that when you collect your dietary intake is for 3 days, and you need to be cautious because because your diet might change based on season, based on week by week. You might have a very busy week that week and you maybe ate less nutritious meals, but next week you ate a better diet. So that's why you need to be a bit cautious when you look at NIVs for specific nutrients from your diet. However, when you look at the findings, if your intake is for specific nutrients is higher than upper limit, this may be a potential risk of adverse effects, but most likely you probably already felt some of those effects if your diet consistently the same throughout, let's say, the year or half year. Is lower than upper limits, intake likely is safe. If intake is higher than recommended dietary intake, so a high level of confidence, we can say that you're meeting the intake, so your intake of that specific nutrient is adequate. If your intake is recommended dietary intake is lower than estimated average intake, most likely you need to increase that particular nutrient. Remember, we talked that probability of adequacy should be about 97-98%. If your intake is lower than estimated average intake, then obviously you most likely need to increase